The collapse of Pakistan-Afghanistan peace talks in Istanbul, November 2025. A strategic analysis. Introduction. In the second week of November 2025, a mediated diplomatic effort between Pakistan and Afghanistan convened in Istanbul with Turkey and Qatar as brokers, formally collapsed. The negotiations were intended to solidify a ceasefire agreed on October 19, 2025, to address the ongoing border security disputes that have decimated material stability in both states. Instead, the process ended in public recrimination, mutual accusation of bad faith, and the return of both parties to entrenched confrontation. What occurred in Istanbul was not merely a failure in terms of negotiation, but a structural breakdown of regional security architecture under pressure of mismatched incentives, conflicting strategic logics, and unresolved legacy tensions dating to the post 2001 Afghan settlement and beyond. Today, I am going to dissect the collapse through three strategic vectors. Vector number one, the incentive misalignment driving both regimes. Vector number two, the operational failure points in the negotiation process. And vector number three, the short and longer strategic consequences for regional security dynamics. The conclusion offers a sober projection of expected regional trajectories, absent substantive, substantive policy alignments. Vector number 1, Incentive Structures and Strategic Goals. Chapter 1.1, Pakistan's Strategic Incentives. Pakistan entered the Istanbul talks with a clearly defined strategic vector to obtain binding guarantees that Afghan territory would cease to serve as sanctuary for militant groups targeting Pakistan, particularly the Taliban Pakistan (TTP). Islamabad's calculus reflects both enduring internal security pressures, rising domestic attacks claimed by TTP's affiliates, and existential anxieties between its western frontier becoming a launchpad for insurgency. This incentive structure has two crucial features. Compliance logic. Pakistan seeks to force Taliban comply through leverage rather than cooperation, assuming that pressure can extract concessions. Sovereignty primacy. Islamabad prioritizes control and deterrence over diplomatic compromise. Any agreement that doesn't materially improve cross-border security is viewed a liability. However, this stance generates a structural contradiction. Pakistan simultaneously demands behavioral change from the Afghan regime, while refusing to make reciprocal commitments of tangible value such as economic incentives or security cooperation frameworks that go beyond pious affirmations. Afghanistan's strategic logic. The Islamic Emirate incentive structure is fundamentally different. The Taliban government, internationally isolated, legitimacy chained, and structurally insecure, operates under the imperative to consolidate internal power, avoid external constraints that might weaken its sovereign freedom of action, deny external attribution, rebuff allegations of harboring militants to preserve its narrative of autonomy. From Kabul's standpoint, any negotiated arrangement perceived as imposing Pakistan's security concerns atop Afghani sovereignty is tantamount to external interference. The incentive to resist binding commitments, absent tangible security or economic payoff, is rational within the Taliban internal logic. Concessions suggest weakness, and weakness risks internal fracturing. Mediators' constraints. Turkey and Qatar, as mediators, often suffer from their own incentive limitations. Their roles are derivative, contingent on personal diplomatic capital rather than institutional leverage. Without enforcement mechanism, their mediation function is persuasive at best. Their credibility rests on fostering enough mutual face savings rather than imposing durable solutions. In context where parties lack symmetrical commitment, such as mediation is inherently brittle. Vector number 2, operational failure points in negotiations. Premature framing of the ceasefire. The Doha brokered October 19 ceasefire was prematurely elevated from a tactical de-escalation mechanism into a strategic peace platform. A ceasefire is a pause, not a plan. Negotiations anchored on a ceasefire without a coherent transition framework, timelines, verification protocols, dispute resolution mechanism was a predictable failure point. Neither side had incentives structured to validate compliance. Instead, both perceived incentives to exploit ambiguity. Disagreement over security responsibility. In Istanbul, proceedings delegated diverged sharply on the core issue, security responsibility. Along the border, Pakistan insisted on joint monitoring, actionable cross-border interdiction commitments. Afghanistan refused any arrangement that could be constructed as ceding control or enabling Pakistani forces to operate within Afghan territory. Failure point: sub-zero framing of security arrangements. Pakistani gains were interpreted as Afghan losses and vice versa. No neutral mechanism, example third-party monitoring, phased verification was tabled effectively. Public escalations concurrent with talks. Gunfire along the Chaman's Spin Boldak border during negotiations, regardless of the source, created a real-world feedback loop that magnified mistrust. Even temporary flare-ups serve as evidence for either side to justify hardened positions. Islamabad's claim breach of ceasefire while Kabul claims Pakistani aggression. Failure point: operational incidents during negotiations are interpreted as signals of bad faith rather than stochastic security noise. Both parties treat tactical skirmishes as strategic messaging. Lack of reciprocal assurance mechanism. Pakistan demanded guarantees without offering binding accountability on its own behavior. Afghanistan insisted on the inviolability of sovereignty without offering verifiable security commitments. This mutual inflexibility creates a coordination failure where both actions rationally choose non-cooperation because neither trusts the other's compliance. Consequences: security, political, and institutional. Regional security volatility. The collapse solidifies a return of kinetic insecurity along the Durand Line. Expect increased cross-border fencing, patrol intensification, and localized eruptions interpreted as strategic signaling. Tactical escalations serving as leverage, not anomalies. Without negotiation space, conflict becomes the default mechanism of registered grievances. Diplomatic isolation and credibility erosion. For Qatar and Turkey, the failure weakens their standing as effective mediators in high-stakes diplomacy. In international fields where leverage is derived from success, failure compounds diplomatic marginalization. Political capital and domestic audience. Both Islamabad and Kabul will recalibrate their domestic narratives to consolidate domestic political legitimacy. Pakistan will highlight failure as a proof of self-defense necessity. Afghanistan will characterize Pakistan's stance as domineering interference. These narratives harden public opinion and reduce incentives for future compromise. Entrenchment of hard security postures. Absent a neutral enforcement mechanism, both states default to militarized deterrence rather than negotiated interdependence. This realignment achieves equilibrium only through mutual strain, not cooperation, a condition far from stability. What if nothing changes, you may ask? If the current strategic trajectory remains unchanged, border tensions escalate, frequent skirmishes become normalized as bargaining instruments, militant ecology deepens, groups like TTP exploit governance vacuums and mistrust between central authorities, diplomatic isolation entrenches, regional actors will hedge rather than invest in peace frameworks. Proxy perceptions intensify. External powers will view the region through a threat lens, not a stabilizing lens. This is not a prediction of outright war, it is a projection of persistent friction without resolution, a structural impasse that cultivates chronic insecurity. Conclusion: the collapse of Istanbul peace talks is not an isolated failure of diplomatic craft, but a predictable outcome of irreconcilable incentive structure. Pakistan's demand for enforceable counterterrorism guarantees clashes with Afghanistan's imperative to defend sovereignty and its autonomy. Mediators lack leverage, security incidents are weaponized in narrative space, and institutional mechanisms for de-escalations are absent. The strategic architecture necessary for peace and binding verification protocol, neutral monitoring regimes, reciprocal security assurances were never in play. Without systematic redesign, negotiations will remain ceremonial, ceasefire will be fragile, and the Durand Line will continue to be a locus of tension, not resolution.